Our protagonist of this story name is Ghislain Perdium. He is an uncontrollable swordmaster. Our man is also always stuck in his room. He is out of his mind that everyone around him think he is insane. And to top it all off, he is Count Perdium's useless trash garbage oldest son that has never accomplished anything in his life. The battlefield was drenched in blood, the air thick with the acrid scent of burning bodies and smoldering ruins. A lone knight, once hailed as the finest warrior of the North, knelt amidst the carnage. His armor, once pristine, was now battered and torn, blood seeping from countless wounds. His breath was ragged, his limbs trembling, not from exhaustion, but from fear. Before him stood the man he had mocked, the one he had dismissed as worthless. Ghislain Perdium, Count Perdium's infamous disgrace, a so-called useless, trash-born heir, a man unworthy of his noble lineage. And yet, here he stood, unscathed, bathed in the warm glow of the inferno consuming the battlefield behind him. In his hand, a massive axe, far larger than any man should wield with ease, rested against his shoulder. His cold, piercing gaze bore into the knight's soul, sending an unbearable chill through his already shattered confidence. Lane took a step closer, the weight of his presence suffocating. He tilted his head slightly, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Warm and cozy, isn't it?" he mused. "I put a lot of money into setting this trap just for you." The knight's breath hitched. His mind raced to comprehend the sheer impossibility of the situation. Trap," he choked out, struggling to maintain his composure. "You're telling me you knew of my plans beforehand?" Lane chuckled, a low, chilling sound that sent shivers down the knight's spine. He continued his leisurely stroll, stepping over lifeless bodies, his boots splashing through the pools of blood that painted the ground. "Not just that," he said casually. "I knew how many of you would be here ahead of time, the exact number and formation, who you sent out to spy on me, who helped you with reinforcements and gave you troops to do this siege. I knew all of it from the very start. My man is starting to sound like Light and L. This is my perfect victory. I won." The knight's world crumbled. He had thought himself a hidden ace, an unstoppable force, yet it now dawned on him. He had been nothing more than a pawn. Lane had orchestrated this massacre from the beginning. The realization constricted his chest, suffocating him with an invisible grip. His body shook violently as he coughed up blood, his voice hoarse as he forced out, "There's no way. I've always been a hidden card. How could a useless piece of shit like you?" Before he could finish, a brutal kick to the face sent him crashing into the dirt. His vision blurred, stars flashing before his eyes as pain exploded across his skull. Blood pooled from his mouth as his consciousness wavered. Lane loomed over him, his expression cold and unreadable. With a smirk, he tossed the knight's helmet aside, letting it clatter against the blood-soaked earth. "Invade as many times as you want," he said, his voice dripping with quiet confidence. "I'll be the one who wins. This time, the next time, every single time after that." He crouched slightly, tilting his head as his smirk widened. "Do you know why?" The knight's fading vision locked on Elaine's face, golden hair, piercing blue eyes, and not a single scratch on him. Ghislain Perdium, the so-called disgrace, the supposed failure. Yet, as the flames roared behind him, illuminating the battlefield in an eerie glow, the truth became undeniable. This was no ordinary man. This was a monster, and he had played them all from the very beginning. A year before the battlefield was engulfed in flames, before blood soaked the earth in his orchestrated victory, Ghislain Perdium awoke. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body drenched in cold sweat. His fingers dug into his neck, trembling as he felt the warmth of his own skin. His head was still attached. His heart still pounded in his chest. "I'm alive." His vision blurred as panic gripped him. Just moments ago. No, it felt like mere moments. He had been staring death in the eye. A memory surged through his mind, vivid and searing, as if it had happened only seconds ago. Two swords clashed, the impact sending one of them flying. He could see himself, battle-worn and covered in wounds, his body broken but still standing. Blood dripped from a dozen cuts, his vision hazy, yet he could still make out the figure before him. A man with crimson hair, longer than his own sword, smirking as he gazed upon his fallen opponent. "So, This is how it ends, the man had said. Ghislain Perdium, the Mercenary King, one of the 7 strongest on the continent. The war is over. The words rang in his skull like a death knell. He had fought with everything he had, but before him stood Idun, the noble knight, a legend in his own right. One of the continent's top 7 warriors, and the man who had brought him to his knees. Lane could still remember the taste of blood in his mouth, the sharp agony as crimson rivers poured from his wounds. He barely had the strength to glare up at his enemy as Idun pointed his sword at him. Any last words? Lane had spat blood onto the dirt and growled. No words. Just regret. I wanted my revenge. I wanted you to die. You sick bastard. Idun's smirk deepened. How arrogant. I didn't expect the eldest son of the fallen Perdium household to crawl his way up to this point. Though you left after your sister died, didn't you? Lane's breath hitched. His mind reeled. How did Idun know that? He was from a different kingdom. How do you know that? He had managed to croak. Idun only chuckled, raising his hand as if to dismiss the question. Of course I know. I spent years tracking you down, after all. My kingdom worked alongside Duke Delphine's household to bring down your family. Lane's world cracked apart. His thoughts spiraled, piecing together the implications of those words. The Perdium family's downfall, the slaughter of his kin, wasn't just orchestrated by Delphine. There were others involved. He had never questioned it before. He had thought the Delphine household acted alone, that it was a betrayal born out of greed. But now, he had been played for a fool. We really went from god to wimp real quick. Choose a side, bro. The realization hit like a hammer, leaving him trembling. Idun saw the look in his eyes and grinned. But there's no point in explaining further, he had said. You're going to be dead soon anyway. Accept your fate, Ghislain Perdium. The sword had risen. Lane had roared. You bastard. I'll never forgive you. And then, blackness. No pain. No light. Just the feeling of cold steel cutting through flesh. And now, here he was. Lane's fingers gripped his neck tighter as his breathing turned erratic. His head was still on his shoulders. His body was whole. He glanced around, his surroundings coming into focus. A dimly lit room. A soldier's tent? No, this wasn't a battlefield. He could hear voices, distant yet familiar. Outside, men were setting up camp. The scent of damp earth and freshly cut wood filled his nostrils. The Lithuania kingdom, near the Perdium estate. 1 year ago, his mind raced, struggling to comprehend what was happening. Was it an illusion? A cruel trick? Had the mages taken his corpse and used him in some twisted experiment? Arrogant bastards, Lane muttered under his breath, his blue eyes gleaming with cold fury. I'll make them regret keeping me alive. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Young master. Lane's head snapped toward the entrance of the tent, where a soldier hesitated before stepping inside. The man, dressed in light armor, carried himself with familiarity. Ricardo, Lane murmured, his mind recalling the name. One of his assigned guards. Ricardo gave a small bow. I know you're awake, young master. Please come outside. Lane narrowed his eyes, his body moving before his thoughts caught up. In an instant, he was behind Ricardo, his sword pressed lightly against the man's neck. The air grew heavy, suffocating. Ricardo stiffened, his breath hitching. I'll let you live if you answer my questions, Lane whispered, his voice like a blade itself. Or maybe not. Beads of sweat dripped down Ricardo's temple, but to Lane's surprise, he didn't beg. Instead, he sighed. Young master, Ricardo said, exasperated. Don't you think this is crossing the line? Lane blinked. What? That was his response. His grip loosened slightly as he observed the soldier. Ricardo's expression wasn't one of terror, but mild frustration, like he was dealing with a troublesome child. What's with that reaction? Lane muttered, lowering his sword slightly. Ricardo straightened, brushing off his uniform like nothing had happened. You tired yourself out earlier, throwing a tantrum, and then you passed out. A tantrum? Lane echoed, his mind racing. Ricardo scoffed, rubbing his neck where the blade had been moments ago. Yeah, you were ranting about leading the squad against the orcs before you collapsed. Lane felt a chill run down his spine. Orcs? Ricardo hoisted a bag from the floor, tossing it toward him. Get your stuff together. People are waiting. Lane caught the bag with one hand, his mind still reeling. Where are we going? Ricardo gave him a strange look. To the Perdium estate, of course. Lane froze. His blood turned cold, his heart thundering in his chest. Say that again. His voice was barely above a whisper. Ricardo hesitated, taking a cautious step back. We're heading to the Perdium estate. Lane's hand shot out, gripping Ricardo's shoulder tightly. The Perdium estate. You mean, the fallen Perdium estate? Confusion flickered across Ricardo's face. Fallen? Young master, are you still half asleep? Lane didn't respond. He pushed past Ricardo, stepping out of the tent, and his breath caught in his throat. Before him lay a thriving city. Farms stretched far and wide. Homes dotted the land. And at the center of it all, standing tall and untouched, was the Perdium estate. The grand castle shimmered beneath the sun, its towers stretching toward the sky. Lane's hands trembled. It's here, not in ruins, not reduced to ash and rubble, not a graveyard of his past failures. The Perdium estate was alive. Did you have a nightmare or something? Ricardo muttered beside him, lowering his voice so only Lane could hear. Calling your own household fallen. If the Count heard you, you'd be kicked out. Lane turned to him, still in shock. His fingers hesitated before reaching for his own cheek. He pinched the skin hard, the sharp sting confirming the truth. It wasn't a dream. The Perdium estate was intact. His body was younger. He had returned to the past. A bitter chuckle escaped him. So that's it, huh? His younger self had resented the Perdium household. He had felt inferior, unworthy, lashing out in childish anger. He had driven people away, made himself a disgrace. Eventually, he had run away to carve his own path, leaving behind the family that had once tried to support him. Years later, he had returned, hoping to make amends. But by then, it was too late. The Perdium estate had been destroyed. His family was gone. And yet, here it stood before him. A second chance. Lane's lips parted slightly, as if to laugh. I want to sing in joy. But now was not the time. He took a deep breath, suppressing the storm of emotions brewing inside him. There was still a raid to handle. The orcs. This was the day everything went wrong. If he let things play out the way they had before, these men, his men, would die. Sweat beaded on his forehead as memories flooded his mind. He knew this day. This was the day. The day when the orc raid went terribly wrong, when the supposed small skirmish turned into a massacre, when nearly everyone in the raid died because of a false report. In his past life, Lane had stubbornly insisted on leading the raid, believing it to be an easy victory. The report had claimed there were only 3 orcs, but when they arrived, there were more than 20. Most of them had died. And now, but this time, he would change it. A loud thud interrupted his thoughts. Something heavy landed, just a few feet away from him. Lane's eyes snapped toward it, his breath hitching. It was a scout tower, and then the screams erupted. The orcs. The orcs are here. Lane's gaze shot up just in time to see them. For massive, red-skinned orcs towered over the battlefield, their monstrous forms sending soldiers into a frenzy of panic. Their weapons, crude but devastating, swung down, crushing men like insects. Lane exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around his sword. Already? Did they arrive this fast in my past life too? Chaos consumed the camp. Men were scrambling to form ranks, their movements desperate, uncoordinated. Get into formation. A voice roared above the chaos. Lane turned, spotting a man rushing forward, his commanding presence undeniable. Scoven, the leader of this battalion, the one who had tried to hold the orcs back in Lane's past life, and failed. Even now, he struggled. His men were flung back with every swing of the orcs' axes, their defensive lines crumbling. Scoven gritted his teeth, eyes flickering with panic. Damn it, we were caught off guard. There are too many. And then, Commander, behind you. Lane's voice rang out before he could even think. Scoven turned, just in time to see a massive orc bringing down an axe twice his size. Time seemed to slow. Lane's body moved on instinct. He dashed forward, shoving Scoven aside. The axe struck the ground where the commander had stood, carving deep into the earth. Gasps echoed around them. Lane didn't hesitate. His sword flashed. A single, precise strike. The orc's arm flew into the air, severed cleanly at the shoulder. Blood sprayed. The beast howled, stumbling backward. Silence followed. Dozens of soldiers gaped at Lane in stunned disbelief. He ignored them. His eyes remained locked on the screaming orc, watching as it collapsed onto its knees. Damn, I can't use mana yet. He clicked his tongue. If only I had returned to my past life earlier. He turned to the still stunned Skovan, stepping toward him. The commander, still on the ground, looked up in shock. Why, young master? Lane smirked, extending a hand. Commander, he said simply. Give it. Skovan blinked. Give what? Lane's smirk widened. The command.